Hi, this is Jeff Mann, and I'm going to be producing a video today on the topic of the motorcycle move. The motorcycle move was designed by a number of golf instructors with the purpose of closing the club face relative to the club head arc in the early downswing. And the reason why some golf instructors believe that's a good idea is they make the presumption that if you close the club face in the early downswing, then you're not going to need to close the club face in the late downswing. Now, the question is, who needs to close the club face in the late downswing? And the answer is the majority of professional golfers who use a weak or a neutral lead hand grip are going to close the club face in the late downswing. And here's an example featuring Bobby Jones here. This is a strobe image that was made in the 1930s where you can see his club head arc and you can see also his club face. And you'll notice that at the end backswing position, the club face is wide open to the club head arc. And in the early downswing here, it still remains open. It's still open. Even when he gets to this position, which is the P6 position, you can see the club face is tilted back and it's still wide open relative to his club head arc. And between here and impact, he has to rotate his club face counterclockwise in order to get it square relative to his club head path by impact. And this is a necessary phenomenon that all professional golfers who use a weak or neutral lead hand grip need to execute. So I'm going to give you an example of this phenomenon by going to the next image. So here's an image of Scottie Scheffler who uses a weak lead hand grip. So if you look at him at the end backswing position, you'll notice his club face is wide open to his path. You know, some people refer to this as being 90 degrees open relative to his club head path. So as he starts the downswing, here he is at P4.5, here he is at P5, there he is at P5. If you look at the red line, which I've drawn parallel to his club face, you can see that it's still wide open. Even here at P5.5, it's tilted back. And if his club head path is in this direction, like the Bobby Jones image, he still has to rotate it another 60 degrees before impact. Now, I'm going to describe the manner in which a professional golfer performs the golf swing if they use a weak or neutral lead hand grip and if they don't use an extraneous technique such as the bowed lead wrist technique. Now, I believe that Scottie Scheffler is using a technique that I call the intact left forearm flying wedge technique combined with a geometrically flat left wrist. Now, I will describe this technique in a future video, and I will only just briefly point out some of the features. So if you look at Scottie Scheffler at his end backswing position, you can't see his lead lower forearm's radial bone, but you can imagine at this position that the club shaft is in line with this bone. And if the club shaft during your entire downswing is always in line with your lead lower forearm's radial bone, that represents what I call an intact left forearm flying wedge. Then, to maintain that relationship, you've got to keep your left wrist geometrically flat. Even if it doesn't look flat, in this instance with Scottie Scheffler, because he uses a weak lead hand grip, it actually looks anatomically flat. But anatomically flat and geometrically flat are not synonymous terms, because if you had a stronger, like a neutral or slightly strong lead hand grip, it would look more cupped there. But as long as the club shaft is in line with your lead lower forearm, that would still be called a geometrically flat left wrist. So let's see what Scottie Scheffler does in his early downswing. So there he is at P4, here he is at P4.5, and here he is at P5 when his lead arm is parallel to the ground. And you can see that the back of his, and I've drawn this blue line parallel to the back of his lead hand, is becoming more horizontal relative to the ground as he shallows the club shaft. But if you look at this red line, which is parallel to the club face, it remains consistently parallel to his club face because he keeps his club shaft in line with his lead lower forearm's radial bone, and he keeps his lead wrist geometrically flat. Here he is at P4.5, and you can see how much he's shallowed the club shaft. At this position, you can see that he's starting to rotate the back of his hand, which was parallel to his swing plane, and now he's going to start to release the club. But during this time period, you'll notice that he still has an intact left forearm flying wedge in a geometrically flat wrist. And to emphasize that point, I'm going to go to the next image. So here is a sort of close-up image of Scottie Scheffler at P5.5. I've drawn a yellow line over his radial bone, which you can now see, lead lower forearm's radial bone. And the club shaft is continuously in line with that radial bone, and that represents an intact left forearm flying wedge. And to maintain that, the left wrist has to be geometrically flat. Notice that his club face is parallel to the back of his lead hand. Now, if you look at his club face in this position, it's tilted back, and he still has to get it square relative to his clubby path. He still has to rotate it another 50 to 60 degrees in a counterclockwise direction. So let's consider, when does he do this? I'm going to go to the next image. So here is the progression of his downswing action. Here he is at P6, here he is at P6.2, and here he is at P6.5. If you look at his radial bone here, and then you look at his radial bone in image 2, you'll notice there's a small degree of counterclockwise rotation of his radial bone. And he needs to do that because he's starting to release the club by uncocking his lead wrist. And as he uncocks it, the club shaft has to go towards the ball but remain on his functional swing plane. And to remain on the functional swing plane, you have to supinate your lead forearm by a small amount as the club shaft starts to release. Notice that during this entire period, he has an intact left forearm flying wedge that, if you look at the club shaft here, it's in line with his radial bone, and here he is at P6.5. You look at the club shaft, it's in line with his radial bone, which means that they're rotating in perfect synchrony, and he still has a geometrically flat left wrist. If he bent his left wrist or extended it, then the club shaft would move out of alignment with the lead lower forearm, and then the left forearm flying wedge would not be intact. So he's maintaining an intact flying wedge, and if you look at the club face, it's closing minimally. So at this point, you can see it's still wide open relative to the club head path. And from P6.5 to impact, he still has to close it. So we'll go to the next image. And here is a face-on image which shows Scottie Scheffler at P6, P6.5 image 2, and impact and image 3. I mentioned to you that between P6 and P6.5, there's going to be a small degree of rotation of the back of his lead hand due to lead forearm supination to keep his club shaft traveling on the functional swing plane. So if you look at where his radial bone is here in image 1, and look at his radial bone here, it's rotated a certain amount. Notice that his club shaft is still in line with his radial bone, which means he still has an intact left forearm flying wedge and a geometrically flat left wrist. But look at his club face. Relative to the club head path, he still has to close it by impact here. And the way he does it is the standard way that professional golfers who use a weak or a neutral lead hand grip square the club face in the late downswing between P6.5 and impact, is he performs a lead forearm supinatory motion, which will rotate the radial bone, if you look there, by the amount necessary in a counterclockwise direction to square the club face. So you can either look at that radial bone or look at the watch face area in his lead lower forearm, or you could look at the logo on his glove and you can see how much he's rotating the back of his lead hand counterclockwise. Now, this phenomenon, I believe, has to happen. There's just no way you can get around it if you perform a golf swing like a professional golfer who uses, like Scottie Scheffler, what I call the intact left forearm flying wedge and geometrically flat left wrist technique. Now, a lot of golf instructors think that this phenomenon of where you have to rotate the back of your hand and therefore the club face in the late downswing between P6.5 and P7 requires a lot of timing, and they say, is there a way that you could avoid this problem? And they come up with the idea that if you could square the club face in the early downswing, then you wouldn't have to square it as much in the late downswing. And the idea that they've come up with is the concept of the motorcycle move. So I'm going to go to the next image. And here is Tyler Ferrell, golf instructor, demonstrating the motorcycle move. So you can see he stands here gripping the club horizontal to the ground, and you can imagine he's riding a motorcycle. Now, when you ride a motorcycle and you want to accelerate it, normally you would twist your hands in a more cup position, all right? But he's twisting his hands, if you look at his lead hand. In this hand, he's just holding it very loosely. But look what he does with this hand. He twists it so it becomes more palmar flexed. Notice as he does that, as he twists the club handle with his lead hand, look how much the club face rotates counterclockwise. That looks like almost 90 degrees. Here, his club face was facing the sky, and here it's facing the camera. Now, this maneuver, some people say, if you're a purist, you should actually call this the reverse motorcycle move because you're twisting it in the opposite direction. But I'm not that pedantic. Because people have always referred to this maneuver as the motorcycle move, I will refer to it as the motorcycle move. Now, what is he actually doing? If you look at it, you'll notice that his left wrist, it looks much more bowed here. And at first glance, you might say, well, if you just bow your wrist, that will cause the club face to rotate in the manner you see here. But I'm going to demonstrate in great detail that this phenomenon that you see in this image is not due to bowing your lead wrist. It's due to twisting the club handle with the fingers so that the club shaft rotates about its longitudinal axis. Now, what Tyler Ferrell is doing here, he never does in his own swing. In other words, when he demonstrates the motorcycle move, he uses a different technique which I will show you. And he doesn't use this technique which he's demonstrating, which I'm going to call the true motorcycle move. And I'm going to show you that he uses a different technique which I'll now explain by going to the next image. So here is an image from Tyler Ferrell's book where he's demonstrating how he performs the downswing. So if you look at this image here where he's at the end backswing, it's hard to see his club face, but it's more or less parallel to his flat wrist, so it's slightly palmar flexed. But if you look at his club face, it's starting to rotate counterclockwise as he starts the downswing. And by the time he gets to the P6 position, I want you to notice that the club face, and this is drawn by this red line, is no longer parallel to the green line, which is the back of his lead hand. And the question is, what is he doing to close the club face here? Now, Tyler Ferrell states that what he's doing basically is he's palmar flexing his lead wrist, he's bowing it. And as you bow it, it causes the club face to close in this manner. So that when you get to this position, P6, you can see it's much more closed relative to the club head path compared to Scottie Scheffler. And look what he says here. The earlier you close the club face to the path with flexion of the lead wrist and extension of the trail wrist, the more you can power the swing with your body and have your body open at impact. What he seems to be implying is that if you close the club face earlier, then you can just turn your body towards impact. And then he seems to be implying, seeing that you've closed the club face earlier, then you're not going to have to close it in the late downswing by using a lead forearm supinatory action. I'm going to show you that he's totally wrong. I'm going to demonstrate with time later in this presentation that if you use this technique that he's demonstrating here, which is not the true motorcycle move, I refer to this technique as the bowed lead wrist maneuver combined with a twistaway maneuver. And I'll explain what this all means in a second. I'm going to go to the next image. And here is, Tyler Ferrell has done many videos on the motorcycle move. And this is just one of his videos on the topic. And this one is called Flexing Your Wrist Golf Club Face Motorcycle Move. And I would recommend that you view this YouTube video, which lasts 17 minutes. And to locate it, you just have to type in this into your YouTube search engine and you can watch the video. Or you can go to his channel, which is the Golf Smart Academy, and look through his list of videos till you find this particular video. Now, in this particular video, he claims that many professional golfers are performing the motorcycle move. And he says you can do it at different times. You can perform the motorcycle move in the backswing, the early downswing, and he even claims you can do it during the release phase. I disagree with all those opinions. The traditional time period when people perform the motorcycle move is usually in the early mid downswing between P4 and P6. So if you start to watch his video, you can see he's featuring two golfers here. This is Henrik Stenson, who uses a neutral lead hand grip. So if you look where I'm pointing here, his lead hand looks slightly cupped at the top. And that's not unusual if you use a neutral lead hand grip. This image here is Justin Thomas. And Justin Thomas uses a weak lead hand grip, and you can see it's much flatter. Notice in both of them that the club face is more or less in line with the back of the lead hand. Now, if you watch the video, they start the downswing, and Tyler Ferrell says they are performing the motorcycle move. Now, let's see what really happens. So I'm going to go to the next image. So here I've taken, you see, he wrote, Tyler Ferrell said, motorcycle transition style. The transition style means that you're performing the motorcycle move in the early downswing as you start the downswing. Now notice here is Henrik Stenson at his P6 position. Notice his lead wrist is slightly palmar flexed, flatter than it was at his end backswing position. So he is palmar flexed in his lead wrist. Notice that his club face here is parallel to the back of his lead hand. Now, if you look at Justin Thomas here, Justin Thomas started with a flat lead wrist at his end backswing position, and here it's slightly more bowed. You can see that it's bowed. But notice that his club face is still parallel to the back of his lead hand. And if you compare them to Scottie Scheffler, I would say there's no evidence that these two golfers are rotating their club face in the early to mid downswing, in other words, between P4 to P6, any more than Scottie Scheffler. I believe they're using the same technique, which is the intact left forearm flying wedge combined with a geometrically flat left wrist technique. But if you look here, this is the image of Tyler Ferrell at his comparable P6 position, and you can see a distinct difference. If you look at the back of his lead hand, it's slightly palmar flexed, but no more really than these other golfers, yeah. But what's very distinctive, he's doing something to close this face here. Look at this red line is closed relative to the back of his hand. Now, when Tyler Ferrell describes it, the motorcycle move, he just says, if you palmar flex your lead wrist, in other words, bow it, that will cause you to close the club face. And I'm saying that's not true, because if you look at these golfers, they did palmar flex their lead wrist, but the club face is not closing. So I believe, and I will explain in detail what Tyler Ferrell is doing here. He's adding an additional club face closing maneuver, which is called a twistaway maneuver. And this maneuver is not the same as a true motorcycle move. And I will now go into great detail to explain the difference between these two different types of ways of performing the motorcycle move. So I'm going to now stop sharing the images, and I'm going to go back to the screen, and I'm going to turn on my camera. So here I am in my spare bedroom, and I'm going to do a lot of demonstrations now. So I'm going to move my chair out of the way. Now, here I am in my spare bedroom, and I have a 6-foot space between the edge of my bed and this wall here. So I have limited space to demonstrate. That's why I use this very short club designed for a 5-year-old child. So let's consider starting off with Scottie Scheffler. So if you adopt a weak lead hand grip like Scottie Scheffler, like this, you can see more or less the club face is in line with the back of your hand. It's also in line with your lead lower radial bone like that. if you use a weak grip. So when you hear, if you look at Scottie Scheffler, as he starts his downswing, you can see the club face is wide open to the path. The path is in this direction, and he would have to do this maneuver to square it, but he doesn't do it in the early downswing. So he comes down the plane, gets down to waist level, then he starts to uncock his lead wrist. And as I said, as you uncock it, I'll stand further away. You also have to do this, watch. I'm uncocking my lead wrist and I'm starting to rotate so that the club shaft can move parallel to the functional swing plane, like that. And as I mentioned, as you go from P6 here to P6.5, there's a small degree of lead forearm supination as the club is releasing to keep it on in the functional swing plane. Then, as I'll demonstrate it from this angle, at P6, he's uncocking it, supinating it a small amount, but then to square the club face by impact, he has to do this, a lead form supination so that he can square the club face. I mentioned to you that the concept of the intact flying wedge, and hopefully you can see this. So here you are, Scottie Scheffler. Here's the club shaft. If I put my fingertips on my radial bone, you can see they are in a straight line, which means I have a geometrically flat wrist. As I come down, it's always the radial bone and the club shaft are always in the straight line. I'll do it from this angle. There. If you look at my radial bone as it rotates, the club shaft rotates in perfect synchrony like that, which means that my lead wrist remains geometrically flat. So this is what I call the standard way that professional golfers who use a weak or lead hand grip are going to perform the club face closing maneuver, which is this. In the late downswing, as the club's releasing, you also have to rotate the back of your hand, the watch face area of your lead lower forearm, to square the face by impact. Now, as I mentioned to you, some golf instructors say, well, that's too complicated. How do you time this motion? I actually think it's quite easy, but some golf instructors say, well, if we could close the club face in the early downswing, then maybe we wouldn't have to close it as much in the late downswing. So this is the technique that they talk about. So I'm going to do it. I'm holding again with a weak grip like that. Notice that the club face is parallel to the ground. Now watch what I'm doing. You see I'm twisting the club handle 90 degrees. Now the club face is facing the camera. How do I do that? You'll notice that my palm is turning in like that. And it's a big mistake to think that it's the bowing of the lead wrist that does it. I'll show you again from this angle. I'm going to keep my forearm, hold my forearm, and I'm going to look at how much I can club. I can close the club face almost 90 degrees like that. Now, how am I doing that? You'll notice the back of my hand is twisting in, which gives people who don't think about golf swing biomechanics very much, because they see that, they think it's the bowing that's doing it. And I'm going to show you what really is causing the club shaft to rotate counterclockwise about its longitudinal axis. To understand that, you've got to think of what you do to flex your fingers to make a grip, a fist. Now, in your forearm here, you have two groups of muscles that can flex the fingers. The one group of muscles is called flexor digitorum sublimis. And that's a big group of muscles here, and it goes through into your palm and it attaches to the base of your fingers. So you've got three finger bones, the proximal phalanx, the middle phalanx, and the distal phalanx. And the tendons attach to the base of the fingers. And if you contract it, this is what happens. Can you see? The fingers flex at the metacarpophalangeal joints like that, but the fingers stay straight. In other words, because they only attach to the base of it, when you contract those finger flexor muscles, and you should do this and palpate your forearm to feel the muscle contract. That's what it does. But the biggest group of finger flexing muscles in your forearm is called flexor digitorum profundus muscle. And those muscles, they go into tendons through your palm, along the ventral aspect of your fingers, and they attach to the tips of your distal phalanx, the third phalanx. So watch what happens if I contract that muscle. I'll do it from different angles. So I'll do it vertically. I'm now starting to contract that muscle, and you'll see the fingertips start to curl in like that. As I contract the muscles more forcibly, I hope you can see it at this angle, the fingers curl in more. Eventually, you get to a point, if you see I'm flexing my fingers like that, where the tips of my fingers can touch my palm like that. Notice that my left wrist is still flat. So I've already closed it like that, but the left wrist is flat. Now I'm going to contract it even more, and then look what happens. In other words, I'm squeezing like that, and you'll notice now the left wrist becomes bowed. But the bowing is not the primary motion. The primary motion is the finger flexors. So now I'm going to do it with the club like this. So I've got holding the club like that, and I'm going to hold my left hand flat, right? And now I'm contracting that muscle so that I make a fist against the club. And notice that the club face is still straight like that, just not twisting. But the tips of my fingers are touching the thinner area of my lead hand there. Now to get the club face to twist, you see how it's twisting close? What I'm doing is I'm contracting that muscle with much greater force. And as I contract it with greater force, it starts to twist the club handle in that way. And because it's twisting the club handle, it also, notice that what it does, it causes the lead wrist to become bowed. And if you feel your radial bone there, watch this. I'll try to do it this angle. It causes the radial bone to rotate in a supinatory direction. And I would encourage you to do this at home yourself. You must do it to become convinced that what I'm saying is correct. So this is the motorcycle move, you see. Now, to do this, and if you look at this area of my palm when I do that, of my forearm, it takes a tremendous amount of muscle contraction of the flexor digitorum profundus muscle in your forearm. And if you do this at home, palpate your forearm and you'll see how tight this muscle is to do the motorcycle move. Now, I call this video presentation, Why Do Professional Golfers Not Use the Motorcycle Move? And the reason is as follows. So let's imagine you were here like Scottie Scheffler and you decided to do that. Look at the club face. See how much I can twist it closed? So you would say, well, isn't that an advantage? Instead of being like Scottie Scheffler here, see where the club face is open, if I did this maneuver, I've closed it, so it would seem like a really good idea. So you got it closed here, and then you would say, well, if it's closed here, I can just go into impact like this. Try this at home. and then I don't have to supinate it. There's one problem with this, and this is as follows. So I'm going to demonstrate it again. I'm here, and I'm really twisting this club handle closed like that. And then I'm doing this. Notice in slow motion, I can come into impact. Look at the club face relative to the back of my lead hand. Look how much it's closed. And if you palpate your arm when doing that, it takes a tremendous amount of muscle force to do that. Now, the reason why professional golfers would never use this maneuver is twofold. So when you swing in a golf club and you want to generate a really fast club head speed of 100 miles or 120 miles at impact, when swinging a driver, you really have to move it fast like this, right? And if your forearm muscles are contracted like this, try and release the club. You can't. It's very difficult to release the club fast if this muscle's contracted. So you can't even get the club to release. Now, if you did release it, right, what would happen in the late downswing to the club face? The presumption is you could really twist it while the club is releasing. But the reality is that if you're generating a club head speed, say of 100, 120 miles an hour at impact with a driver, in the late downswing, the club, as it releases, is exerting an outward pull of about 100 pounds of centrifugal pull outwards away from you. And that pull is so powerful that it's impossible for these muscles to remain flexed. So watch this. So let's say you really tightened it and you think you can do this, but because the club is pulling you, it will stretch your finger flexor muscles. So when you get to impact, you've lost all that club face closing action that you desired, and you're still therefore going to have to supinate your arm. Now the problem is with this maneuver, if you really think of doing it, is you're really tightening your finger flexor muscles like this, trying to keep it flexed. While that's happening, the club is releasing fast and stretching your arm like that. So from swing to swing, depending on how tight you make these muscles and how powerful that centrifugal action is, you would be very inconsistent in terms of your ability to keep it closed. And as I said, this tightening of the muscle, and you have to try this yourself with a club, trying to do I call the true motorcycle move. If you feel your forearm here and the muscles contracting, you would never be able to release the club fully. So I have never seen a professional golfer use this motorcycle move, ever. And to me, it makes sense to me. I actually think this maneuver is very natural, as Scottie Scheffler does. Now I'm going to describe the other variation of the motorcycle move that Tyler Ferrell uses. So let's go back in time. I mentioned to you that the true cause of this club rotating about its axis is the finger flexor muscles contracting and twisting the club handle in a counterclockwise direction. I want you to notice that when I do this, watch, the club shaft remains in the same position relative to the arm. So although my wrist is bowed, the club shaft is not angulating away. Now I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to stand there again with a neutral, weak lead hand grip, club shafts in line with my left arm, and I'm going to bow my wrist. Watch this. I'm going to hold my forearm, and all I'm going to do is bow the wrist. Notice if you bow the wrist without clenching it with your fingers, it causes the club shaft to angle in that direction. Look at the club face. Notice the club face remains neutral. It's not rotating in a counterclockwise. In other words, pure palmar flexion, as I'm demonstrating, does not twist the club handle about its face. To get the wrist to rotate slightly closed there, you have to do something different. So watch here. I've angled it like that. Notice the club face remains parallel to the back of my hand, and it's not closing. Now watch what I do. I'm doing the same maneuver, but can you see it's closing? So what am I doing differently as I palmar flex the lead wrist? So what I'm doing is I'm applying what's called the twistaway maneuver. So to understand that, here's my hand. So you can go from a flat left wrist and you can palmar flex it. And you notice the fingers are straight. But imagine as you do that, you circumduct your wrist and roll it like that. Now what would make you do that? And the answer is as follows. So you're gripping the club like this and you start to bow your lead wrist, but at the same time you use the third, fourth and fifth fingers to squeeze it like that. Notice the squeezing action of those three finger muscles twists your hand under like that. Notice these knuckles, third, fourth and fifth, twist more than the index finger knuckle, you see? That's called the twist-away maneuver. The twist-away maneuver is what causes Tyler Ferrell's club shaft to shut up. So watch me here. So this is Scottie Scheffler, club face is open. Now I'm going to bow the wrist. Notice bowing, see how it angles the club shaft backwards, but look at the club face, it's not really closing. Now I'm going to bow my wrist and I'm going to twist it like that. Now you see the club face is closing. And I'll show you something else. When I do a pure palmar flexion maneuver, the club shaft remains parallel to the ground. As I apply a twist-away maneuver, you notice how the club shaft dips underneath in an underplane direction, you see, like that. So when you look at those images of Tyler Ferrell, and he looks like this, and he's applying a bowing maneuver with a twist away, he looks like that. Notice that his club shaft is slightly angulated, a little under the plane, and the club shaft is closed by an extra, say, 20 to 30 degrees. So that's what Tyler Ferrell is really doing in his swing and when he demonstrates his version of the motorcycle move. Now, this is the interesting part. Let's say, as I said, it's not practical to use the true motorcycle move. The true motorcycle move can really cause the club shaft to rotate a lot, but it requires just so much activation of your finger flexor muscle and so much tension in your forearm, it's not practical to use in a real life golf swing if you want to play at a professional level. But what about this move, you see? So you bow your wrist and you get to a little bit of club. Is that functional? And the answer, very much so. So a lot of professional golfers like Tyler Ferrell use this maneuver. See there? Now the interesting part comes. If you use I call this the bowed lead wrist technique with a degree of twist away, and you can vary, because when you perform the twist away, you can vary how much you close it. And Tyler Ferrell and most professional golfers who use this technique, which I call the bowed lead wrist technique, close it by about 20 to 30 degrees. Now, Tyler Ferrell said that the advantage of doing his version of the motorcycle move, he said, if you get, watch, I'll do it here, you're coming down and you start twisting like that. When you get to this position, P6, you could just turn into impact and the club face will be square because you've rotated in an extra 20 degrees. And this is the interesting part. He's wrong. What really happens in professional golfers who use the bowed lead wrist maneuver like this and come into impact like this with a bowed wrist, they have to use more lead form supination. And if you're hearing this for the first time, you might say, hang on, this sounds counterintuitive, right? Because if you've closed it like 20 degrees extra by using a bowed wrist, you would think you wouldn't need to use more lead form supination. You would think, well, the whole idea was to close it early so you wouldn't have to close it late. And the reality is you have to actually use more lead form supination. Now, to describe why that is true will take a long explanation. So I'm going to do the next episode, which I'm going to call Why Professional Golfers Who Use the Bowed Lead Wrist Technique have to use more supination. And it's going to take a lot of explanation, so I'm going to close this video presentation and end it, leaving you with time to think about why would it require more lead form supination if you use this variation of the motorcycle move, which I call the bowed lead wrist and twist away maneuver. And I will discuss that in the next episode, which will be episode 4, called Why Do Pro Golfers Who Use the Bowed Lead Wrist Technique Have to Supinate their lead form more in the late downswing. So I'm going to stop this recording